But the Maxwell dynasty is way more fascinating and way darker. A fairy story in reverse, in which the beautiful princess starts out as a beautiful princess and she ends up in a kind of dungeon. Her problem was that because of her upbringing under her father, she didn't have a moral compass. Other people, it doesn't matter about other people, you can them. If I go to the toilet and use a cloth towel, I can just leave it there because the other person who's got to pick it up, they don't matter. And if that is your upbringing, then where's the moral compass that says don't do this? But what Epstein would have been very good at would have been to have turned this into a joke, turned this into a game. Also, there's something else that's going on, which I touch on briefly, that he was a transhumanist. Transhumanism believes that humanity is evolving into a higher state, and it's obsessed with the brain, and how essentially, that there are people who are going to be uber brainy who exist on a higher plane. And there's been some reporting that Epstein wanted to impregnate lots and lots of women with his sperm because he was some kind of Superman. Now, this is Nazi stuff in my book. It's gibberish. It's not anything like proper science whatsoever. It's a load of Nazi plain English, and I hate it. And it's very, very creepy. Number one, if Epstein is a superhuman, well, what about the other people? What about the poor girls he's preying on? Looking at Prince Andrew cannot explain the picture of him with his arm round Virginia Robert Giuffre, shot, story goes, by Jeffrey Epstein in Ghislaine Maxwell's flat. Prince Andrew can't explain that. Now, I used to work for Newsnight, and I thought Emily Maitlis's interview with Prince Andrew was an extraordinarily brilliant piece of journalism. And Prince Andrew reminded me of a freshly slaughtered cod landing on the fishmonger's slab. He couldn't explain what had happened, and it didn't make sense to me, and I didn't believe him.
People are absolutely obsessed with the Epstein-Maxwell case on this channel. Looking at the news stories, the whole world is obsessed with it. Why did you get into the Epstein-Maxwell case?
And the moment I left the BBC, I pitched Ghislaine Maxwell because she'd gone missing. And I'm always interested in people who vanish off the face of the earth. And what happened was, first I went to LBC, who said, yes, this is interesting. We're keen on this, and then nothing happened. And basically, the reason for that was first the election. Obviously, they're busy. Then the virus hits, and then everything sort of slows down. So it was only on July the 1st that I actually signed the contract with them and the Story Lab to do the hunting Ghislaine, and she was found on July the 2nd. So I phoned up the boss, Chris Baum, at LBC, and I said, I signed the contract. And he said, I don't care. It's still fascinating. As I say in the podcast, it's a fairy story in reverse, in which the beautiful princess starts out as a beautiful princess and she ends up in a kind of dungeon. And it's a kind of, I find the psychology of the story completely fascinating. To be fair, I was a reporter on The Observer back in the day, and I knew friends of mine who worked on the Mirror and told me these astonishing stories about Robert Maxwell, that he was a psycho and weird, and yet they kind of liked him. He was one of them said from the Daily Mirror, well, he was a monster, but he was our monster. So her father, Robert Maxwell, he makes his money from newspapers, but before then he does a series of magazine deals with scientific publication, very smart at the back end of at the end of World War II. And he does a lot of business with the Soviet bloc. And to keep that business sweet, he does something really quite disgusting, which is a series of hagiographies of the nasty dictators who were the Soviet placement in Eastern Europe. So celebrating Todor Zhivkov, the strongman of Bulgaria, and the one I was most interested in was Nicolae Ceausescu. Now, so for this book, the celebration of Nicolae Ceausescu, he asked a question, Mr. Ceausescu, President Ceausescu, you've been president of Romania for 17 years now. What's the secret of your success? There's no mention of the secret police. What happens is that as a reporter on The Observer in 1989, all the good reporters are sent to Panama with the CIA trying to get rid of Noriega, which means there's only rubbish left. And I'm actually the gossip columnist. And the foreign editor said, and there's this big big death in Timisoara just before Christmas, 1989. And the foreign editor points at me and says, Peter, go to Timisoara. And then I get to Timisoara, and then I phone him and say, by the way, my name's John. Like he sent the wrong person. But never mind. I drove across from Timisoara. I drove across the Romanian Revolution on Christmas Eve 1989, getting to Bucharest at night and we were threatened by the Securitate and shot at by revolutionaries the whole way through. Terribly exciting. But I had a personal kind of who were Nicolae Ceausescu's friends and not my friends. And one of those was Robert Maxwell. So I'm in the wars in Yugoslavia, again reporting for The Observer. And there's a terrible siege in Dubrovnik at the end of, towards the back end of 91. And I'm basically stuck in the siege, and I'm going to miss my son's birthday. And I eventually get out by hiding in a ferry which will take women and children only, and I've got a UN pass, but the captain says no. If he's a Croat captain going to a Serb point in there's a kind of armistice-y thing, but he's afraid to take me even though I've got a UN pass. Did
you have to get in drag outfit to get on that?
So I hid in a ladies' toilet in the ferry. And by the way, if you're a bloke, anyway, let's not go there. But I managed to get out, and I'd seen too many horrible things from the spring onwards, the breakup, the fall of Yugoslavia. And the thing that really upset me, I can still remember it now, was there was this little kid who had salt and pepper hair, was like 5, little boy, and he'd been hit by a shell which had hit his upper leg. It hadn't hit his groin, but he was going to be okay. But he looked like my son, and I can remember crying in hospital, and the doctor I was with saying, have you shouldn't be doing this, and actually, I wanted to say, listen, I've seen people with their heads blown off, but this is getting to me because it's getting to me. So I got out by hiding in the ladies' toilet. Thank you very much for those nice ladies who actually they kind of, some of them had seen me in, and when I managed, just as we were docking, they all kind of grinned at me, and I was trying to say, I'm sorry. Anyway, but I got out, got back to London. And we went shopping on the Asda on the A3 at Roehampton. And then suddenly on the PM programme, there's news that Robert Maxwell is missing from his yacht. And I can remember it's my ex now, but lovely woman. She says, "Are we going shopping or what?" And I said, "I'm terribly sorry. I've got to listen to this." And I can remember just sitting there, and she's buying nappies and Weetabix and everything, and I'm just shirking my shopping duties because I'm obsessed with this. But because I'm tearful, I can't go and do the story. So the weird thing about Hunting Ghislaine, it's me trying to do this story about Robert Maxwell and what happened, disappearing into the sea 30 years on from when it happened, because it's a story that I've always wanted to tell, and I've finally been able to have the opportunity to do it.
This is what we are talking about on this channel, to understand the Epstein story, you have to understand the Robert Maxwell story. And you mentioned Bulgaria, Romania, Maxwell laundering money through Bulgaria, capitalizing on the whole situation. But before we get to all that, because I was absolutely flabbergasted researching Robert Maxwell, that he built this network of organized crime, politicians, intelligence agencies. I've never seen a network like it out of anyone I've ever researched, but it is astounding. And you almost have a begrudging respect for what he did. Like you said, he's our monster. How could you do this?
Yeah, he was. I mean, it's kind of like the people who wrote HBO's Succession have kind of understated it, because they kind of, it's a bit based on Murdoch, that. But the Maxwell dynasty is way more fascinating and way darker. So he comes from a dirt poor Jewish family.
Could you describe in detail how he just came from that family to rise up?
So he came from a dirt poor family in what was then Czechoslovakia. I think he was born in 1923, if memory serves. He's very, very poor, Orthodox Jewish, and he's a big guy, though. His dad's a big guy, and he's a big guy. You can feel the anti-Semitism getting worse and worse in the 30s. He gets out quite early on, and he makes it eventually to France, and he's a Czech, and he's with the kind of Free Czech army, and eventually he gets to Britain. And he joins the British Army. He's good. He's got a gift for languages, and he can. So at this point, he's speaking Czech, Hungarian, German, all the languages he would use back home. And then he learns English very, very quickly and rises through the ranks. He keeps on changing his name, and at one point, he storms a German machine gun nest in early 45 and gets the military cross given to him by John Montgomery. He is a brave man. Then what happens is that towards the very end of April 45, Hitler's got a month to live, and the Germans are surrendering. So there's one town. The mayor comes out with the white flag. He said the troops in the town are going to surrender. And there's somebody in an SS tank who doesn't agree with surrendering. And he fires a shell at the British lines. And the poor mayor can't control the guy from the SS. Isn't expecting this. And Maxwell takes out his gun and shoots him. And actually that's it's in his own authorized biography. And he was being investigated for that war crime when he died. Now, so there you are. There you've got Robert Maxwell in a nutshell. He is incredibly brave. He's courageous. He's also a cold-blooded killer, both at the same time. When he finally he ends up the war as a captain with an MC and admired for what he's done. Not that bit, but generally he's perceived to have had a good war. He gets himself to Budapest, and he finds out that his mum and dad and his 3 younger sisters and brothers are all dead, as is their community, as is nearly all of European Jewry. So you've got to feel sorry for him for his background, for piring out. He then does this clever deal where he buys up German scientific publications, which have pretty much been kind of locked away from the Nazis. So there's treasure there, and he sees the treasure, and he builds and builds and builds, and he makes a ton of money. He then overdoes it and crashes, and there's a big investigation into him being a crook, essentially, because what he's doing is he's boosting his sales and lying about it. And eventually he's found out, and there's a government, a Board of Trade Inspectors report in 73, I think it is, in which it says we do not think he's the kind of person who should run a publicly quoted company, a company on the stock exchange. That should be the end of him. It isn't. He's done something clever, he survives, and he comes back. And from then on, his nickname is the Bouncing Czech. He's also known as Captain Bob. Now the thing is, he is genuinely kind of. I mean, I know good people who really good Fleet Street reporters who liked him, and if you listen to the Hunting Shalem podcast, you get it that actually there's something kind of amazing about this man. There's one merchant banker, a Rothschild, who said, "I've shot Robert Maxwell through the head between the eyes 17 times this morning, and he keeps on getting up and coming at me." He was vast, 6'3", 6'4". At his death, something like 23 stone. He had a head of thick hair, which had obviously gone grey, and he used to dye it raven black. So he looked, at the end of his life, like a bloated version of Jabba the Hutt. Tremendous posh English, far posher than you will ever speak, Shaun. And because Altrincham is posher than Widnes, folks. But he's got this animal charisma, which is he's a bit like Trump. Let's not go there. But he's got this charisma. He's got a following, and then he's got people who hate him. One of those people is Rupert Murdoch. And to be honest, of the two, I would be on Maxwell's kind of side. Why not? And then there's the City of London establishment. They're anti-Semitic, they're anti-Jewish back in the 50s and 60s in an unpleasant way, and he bests them. Good on him, you'd think. But there's a problem, because he is a terrible bully. And the people who worked for him, he takes over the Mirror in 1984. And the people who work with him tell terrible stories. And then there is dishonesty, and then there is a kind of cruelty. So take the dishonesty, there's a game, a football game called Spot the Ball, where mirror readers were invited to spot the ball. I imagine that's the goal, and imagine there are three players all looking as the forward heads the ball into the back of the net. So where's the ball? And you've got all three players, the goalie, the guy heading the ball, and the defender there, and they're all looking, and so the ball would be there, yeah? On Spot the Ball, it was down here, because you didn't want, the prize was £1 million, but if you put the ball there, following the logic, it would be down there. And this was so bent, and he didn't want anyone to win, because at the end, he was running out of money. Now, that's the simplest way of understanding what was going on, but he was also, at the very end, he was stealing money from the banks, and he was robbing Peter to pay Paul. Who cares? Well, you should have a banker on one of these days. I'm using my words advisedly. I'm not rhyming. Or anyway, but this is the big crime in my book, in everybody's book. He was stealing money from the Mirror pension funds, 400 million quid, which meant that people who'd worked their entire life for the paper had suddenly found themselves getting half of what they were expecting to when they're 70 and 80. This was a nasty thing to do. As well as that, he became more and more difficult and crazy as he got older and older. Now, there's Roy Greenslade tells this story, which we didn't have time for, but there's one point where they're taking the helicopter back from the Labour Party conference. He's in it with Betty, Robert Maxwell's wife, the pilot, and Robert Maxwell gets annoyed with the pilot for driving the helicopter. So at one point he takes over the thing you drive it with. What's it called? I've forgotten.
Joystick.
Yeah, the joystick. And the pilot, what's going on? And Betty loses it. What are you doing, you stupid man? And that's how arrogant and stupid he was. He had a helipad in the heart of London. He would urinate off the top of it. He would off the top of it onto the ants below, because who cares about them? He would use cloth towels to wipe his bottom.
Ooh.
And then leave them around for his poor Filipino mates to pick up.
That, James? Wiped his bum with cloth towels.
And leave them. So that now there's somebody who's losing it. Then how he treats his family. So there are various versions of this, which we go into in the podcast. Some some there's good evidence for, some of it is more difficult. But Betty Maxwell, his widow, wrote a book before she died, and she describes, it's obvious that she loves this guy. She has 9 children with him. She's rebuilding the family he lost in the Holocaust. And she loves him. And she says, at one point she writes to him saying that the way you treat your family, I regret recreating your murdered family for you. It's incredibly tough for a woman who loves him. She said, you behave dictatorially, you're harsh, you're brutal, you behave, you take sadistic pleasure in crushing the people around you, the family. He beat his own kids. Now, that was kind of common back in the day. And remember, he was born in 1923. So that's not uncommon, but he beat his children. Now, this story, we don't know whether it's true because there are only, there are 2 witnesses to it, but I'll tell you the story. We don't know whether it's true. There's a woman called Eleanor Berry who has she's the daughter of the rich man who owns the Telegraph group of newspapers, the Berrys. Her name's Eleanor Berry, and she's eccentric. At one point, she's got mental health problems. At one point, Robert Maxwell saves her from electroconvulsive shock therapy, right? So she's not a reliable witness, but somebody I know, former editor of Private Eye, Richard Ingram's, believes this story may well be true. He's inclined to believe it's true. What she says is that she was once shown on a table in the big fancy house that Maxwell had in Oxford, Headington Hill Hall, a series of implements with which Robert Maxwell used to beat his daughter Ghislaine. And Ghislaine tells Eleanor Berry, according to Eleanor Berry, that Daddy was nice to me because he would allow me to select which one to be beaten with. At that point, Ghislaine is 9. Now, I don't know whether that story is true. I'm not saying it's true. It's a story told in her book by Eleanor Berry, and she, as I said, is an eccentric woman and may not be reliable.
1 second. She also tells it on YouTube. The video is out there if people want to watch it in Elena's own words. And I was going to ask you if you thought that perhaps, if it is true, subconsciously that may have laid down some kind of sadomasochistic streak in Ghislaine.
Eleanor Berry also talks about Betty Maxwell giving her a book of Marquis de Sade, and 2 more pieces of information. In 2002, Vicky, I'm trying to remember the name of the British reporter who worked for Vanity Fair. I've forgotten her name. Anyway, the reporter working for Vanity Fair interviews Epstein in Manhattan, and there's only 1 book in the Manhattan house on show, and it's Marquis de Sade. And when the Palm Beach Police Department raided Epstein's house in Palm Beach, they find an Amazon receipt for 3 books about sadomasochism. So what you've got there is some evidence. The first piece of evidence is more difficult to assess. I don't know what happened because I wasn't there, but it's clear that Epstein was into sadomasochism, and this evidence from Eleanor Berry points to Ghislaine being there. Now, there's a difference in that none of the women, these young girls who were sexually abused by Epstein, talk about physical sadism. But there is a kind of psychological sadism in what happens to them. They didn't know that they were going to be, or the ones I've spoken to, didn't know that they were going to end up giving sex massages. They didn't know that. And then there's another piece of detail from the Vanity Fair writer. When you went into his house in Manhattan, the hall was decorated with glass eyes made for British Tommies, British soldiers in the First World War who'd been blinded. And they'd obviously overproduced these awful things. And so this wall was covered with this stuff as you come into the house. And that's creepy with a capital C, Shaun.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who can imagine the suffering of that generation, the First World War, that'd be blinded, for that to be a kind of talking point in your house as you come in, that's, to me, that's about sadism. It's about frightening people and creeping them out and enjoying it and savoring it.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast. It's with my sponsor, Shopify. When I started this podcast, there were a lot of things I had to figure out on my own. Algorithms, guest booking, marketing. I was a bit naive about what was involved, and as you get deeper into it, it starts to overwhelm your life. Finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything can be such a game changer. For millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started, such as my co-host Ron's Pokemon business. Get started with your own design studio of hundreds of ready-to-use templates. Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand style. Accelerate your content creation. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. Get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you. Easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. And best yet, Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.co.uk/Shaun, SHAUN. Go to shopify.co.uk/Shaun. Shopify.co.uk/Shaun. Link in the description if you're watching on YouTube. Thanks for supporting our sponsor. Back to the podcast.
Now, one of the witnesses against Epstein is a woman called Maria Farmer, who says that when she was a receptionist in the house, for Epstein's house in Manhattan, she was taken into a back room and there were TV monitors. Remember, this is 96 when you had to have monitors to show stuff. But basically the monitors showed, there's a bank of monitors, and they showed all the, toilet, massage table, bed. So toilet, massage table, bed, again and again and again. So I suspect that there was also a TV camera hidden in the hall, and people could see this wall of glass eyes and watch the fear in their minds. So the kind of working hypothesis of our podcast, Hunting Ghislaine, is that when her father dies, Ghislaine Maxwell loses one monster, she goes to Manhattan and finds another.
This is absolutely breathtaking. And for people on this channel who are obsessed with this case, the information you've given us today, honestly, it's really putting a lot of things into place that we've been trying to work our way around and research. So you've covered tons of ground there. So I've got a few questions just going back over everything what you've said. First one then is, so my understanding is Maxwell's mum, Robert Maxwell's mum, told him to go to England and copy the mannerisms of an English gentleman and you'll succeed in life. And then we've got these descriptions of his very early humble origins. Do you think that his early humble origins, he described them accurately or he exaggerated them to do a rags to riches?
I think he was poor. His old man was a smuggler, and they lived on the edge of the old it was Czechoslovakia, which had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I think that they were poor, but he knew how to jump across borders. He knew how to trade, and so you get that flavour of stuff. But I think he really was poor. I think, for example, somebody phoned me up, or somebody emailed me, who wants to do research into rich men going to the toilet in this way, or leaving that, for example, wiping their bottom of, and also the other thing he used to do was have meetings with people while he was on the loo, and you could hear him evacuate and stuff like that. Now, I believe that to be true, and this young woman researcher got in touch with me and said, do you think many rich men do this? And my speculation is that Rupert Murdoch or Bill Gates don't do this because they were brought up in money anyway. Or Bill Gates was relatively well off. Rupert Murdoch was very well off. His father was a rich man. And they wouldn't do this. But it's the kind of thing, if you were brought up dirt poor, you would do. And as you get older, you kind of revert in a funny way. So that's my my sense of it is that, yes, he was very, very poor. He was streetwise and cunning, which is how he survived. He was a great survivor. The whole family are survivors too. I don't know about the story about the mum. It could well be true. He does have an opportunity when I think he's in North Africa. He could have gone to the States, but he ended up going to Britain. I think that's primarily because Britain was in the war in 1940 when he had to make his decision, and America was still neutral at that point.
Okay, so he built this empire then based on unlocking this treasure trove of scientific documents that were translated. Now, tens of millions of people were involved in World War II. What made him unique, a soldier, to be able to see that treasure trove, to access that treasure trove, and then to parlay that into this massive fortune?
What happened was that there was a German publisher called Springer who wanted to publish. He wanted to publish his newspaper, and he also knew people who wanted to publish their scientific papers from before the Nazis. So there's a memory going back. We can make money out of doing this, and we've got this stuff. The problem is, being German at this point in 1945, 1946, they weren't allowed to. The man in charge of both censoring but also approving paper. So I am the officer in charge of allowing you, if you're German, Shaun, in 1946, to publish a newspaper. That man is Robert Maxwell.
Oh! So, filling in all the blanks, John Sweeney. We have skirted around these things for so long.
So he is in a perfect place, and he's the son of a smuggler. He's the son of a smuggler who knows how to horse trade, and so what he does is that he uses his, and is it a bit corrupt? I'm sure it is. It's also kind of virtuous, because what he's essentially doing is giving an injection of money and belief into good Germans who want to publish good stuff, and pick up Germany's defeated, and pick it up and help them and get them going again. So that it's not all crooked money here. Did he make a ton of money off the back of this position? Yes, but he saw his opportunity and went for it. So fair play to him. That's a good thing. Now, anyway, ask me far away.
All right. So I own my own little publishing.
I can talk about this all the time.
Yes, let's.
I need to go to bed at midnight. We've got 5 hours.
The longest podcast we've done
is a joke.
The longest one we've done so far is 4 hours 10 minutes.
I'm not doing that.
John Wedge is like, I got my record. All right, so in this modern era of the internet and technology, I've got my own little publishing company, and I can facilitate that, through files and stuff. We're going back now almost 100 years when technology was a lot different. It must have been quite cumbersome, though, even though he's got this connection and he sees these scientific documents, to then build a publishing company in that era. Isn't that a lot of hard work?
Not really, because the German publishers had done it before. So what happens is, when the Nazis come along in 1933, everything becomes a national state secret, and they close it down. But before, when in the Weimar Germany, when they had proper German publications, and it would be the German. I'm making this up, but you get the flavour of it. The German magazine of metallurgy, you know, German magazines, periodicals, really, on chemistry. We can do this. This is a clever way of making synthetic rubber. And suddenly, that's worth money, and all the big universities in the West want to buy a copy. So it was he saw it was a license to print money. He wasn't a genius, because the guys who wanted to do that knocked on the door. But I'm not doubting for a second, Shaun, that he was a great entrepreneur, and he had a tremendous memory. It was eidetic, I think, is the clever phrase for it. I'm not quite sure what it means, but it's something like it's photographic, and he could also, he's British, although actually he's originally Czech, but he's pretending to be posh British. He's working with Germans, and he's making money. Then he works out that the next hidden market after Germany rises and rises, but still he's got his magazines and periodicals. He never loses that for a long, long time. He then starts going in and trading with the Soviet bloc as well, which is another difficult area. And people are going, well, what's he doing over there? Now, part of it is because he's from there. Part of it is because he speaks the language. He affects throughout his life to being a socialist, though actually he behaves like a kind of monster capitalist the whole way through, in the way he deals with his own family, with people, his employers, all that stuff. So he's a blazing hypocrite, which is the kind of person who actually went down well with the Ceausescu's of this world. His problem is that after 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of Soviet Eastern Europe, his old fishing grounds had closed down. They were onto new things, and so he was a kind of a beast from another time, kind of like a polar bear, but the ice cap was melting, and he made a series of mistakes. The big one was he wanted to best Murdoch. He wanted to be a big publisher in the States, and he went in and bought stuff in the States. The Macmillan Airline Guide, which was a silly bet he made, and basically he paid $1 million more. Then there was a financial crash, 91, and suddenly he couldn't run his business. And what he started doing was robbing Peter to pay Paul. Now, in his mind, it didn't matter, but he became his share price kept on going down and down and down, and then he started raiding his workers' pension funds. And at one point, Ghislaine, according to Tom Bauer, has written the definitive book about Robert Maxwell. A year before he dies, it's the 5th of November 1990, she flies Concorde, goes to New York, meets a lawyer who gives her paper representing shares with Berlitz Language School, which is worth $200 million. And that belongs to one of his publicly quoted companies on the London Stock Exchange. She flies back. I think she parties in New York, then flies back the next day and gives it to Robert. And then Robert puts it in one of his private companies. So what's happened is he's just stolen $200 million from the shareholders in his publicly quoted company. And he kept on doing that again and again and again, but he couldn't keep up. And then we get to the place where in October 1991, he goes on his yacht. Now it's called the Lady Ghislaine, after his little daughter who he loved the most, after his daughter is currently in prison in New York. She denies the 6 charges she's facing, but she's rotting in hell in an awful prison cell. So the question you've got to ask is Robert Maxwell the man who ended up deforming this poor woman? So that's how she ended up in this awful place she's in.
I think there's definitely a role there, but there are some complexities. And one of the reoccurring themes throughout Maxwell's life, and Epstein as well, is the role of the intelligence agencies. So Maxwell, he'd go to Russia, sit down with the president of over there and the intelligence agencies, laundering money through Bulgaria, in with the Bulgarian intelligence agencies, come back to the UK, give information to MI5, MI6, CIA, and then go over to Israel and give information to Israel. There was just so many involved.
There were, but my view, I'm skeptical about how this nets out, but there's a time thing going on here as well, Shaun. There's some gossip that, remember, he's Czech, and the Czechs have got a big arms industry, which, unlike the German arms industry, wasn't destroyed entirely during the war. And there are stories that he helped supply the new Israeli army, the new Israeli Defense Force, before it actually started, with enough machine guns to get it going. Remember, when he died, he had a big, fancy funeral in Jerusalem, and there were 6 former heads of Israeli intelligence there. So he's big potatoes. The question is, when did he do the big favor? And I think it was back in 48, 49, when Israel was desperate for weapons, where the rest of Europe and the Americans were wary of giving it to them, and Maxwell got them out. That's my number one feeling about it.
Are you saying then that Maxwell made his intelligence agency connections in the 1940s? That's when it began.
I'm saying that there are stories, I don't know for a fact, but there are stories that he helped run guns to nascent Israel when it really, really needed them. And that is why he got his fancy funeral, virtually a state funeral in Israel, rather than he gave them fantastic secrets later on, because by the end of his life, Israel was a very thriving and successful country. It didn't need Robert Maxwell like it really needed somebody like Robert Maxwell in 1948. But going through his career, he's certainly going to the Soviet bloc when hardly anybody was, and the British certainly used businessmen who went across as spies. There's a guy called is it Wynne? I've got his book somewhere. I think it's Gregory Wynne. Somebody watching can correct me if my memory is wrong. But there is a series of people who do that. In Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, there's a guy called Jerry Westerby. I think it's Westerby, who is the newspaper man who works for the comic. It's in the one with Guinness, the TV series, and he reports back to MI6 about what he's seen. And there's a twist in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. So it's very possible that Maxwell did that. And may also now, most of his life he denied his Jewishness, and it was only towards the end of his life that he actually became very conscious of his Jewish roots, almost like in the last year of his life. So, but my view is, if you asked me, which you have, that I don't think he was of great use to Mossad, for example, number one, when at the time of his death, because he'd lost his common sense. Basically, this is a man who had a thriving publishing empire worth roughly £1 billion, say, in today's money, and then he gambled $2 billion on it, which he didn't have at the worst possible time, buying stupid investments, and then robbed Peter to pay Paul, and was about to be found out when he fell off his yacht. Was he pushed or did he jump? Good question. We'll get onto that. But I don't think that's a reason for me. If I'm running Mossad, I'm wary of this man because I know he's a loose cannon, and I may have historic favours I want to thank him for, so I'm going to give him a fancy funeral, but he's not high-grade intelligence source material, somebody you want to protect or somebody you want to murder.
So it seems that everybody has a life cycle of usefulness to the intelligence agencies. So let's go back to when Maxwell was peddling Promise software. What do you know about that?
I don't know much about it because I haven't gone into that bit, or rather, my focus, Chris Borman, at LBC Global, Global owns LBC, which used to be called the London Broadcasting Corporation, it's just LBC these days, said, stick to Ghislaine, stick to Ghislaine, stick to Ghislaine. Is this the Bulgarian stuff that we're talking about?
So Promise Software had a back door in it.
Oh, yes. No, this is the Israeli, the software.
Yeah.
Now, that's interesting, but I don't think it's... So here's what I think, is that just the other day, for example, in relation to Khashoggi, the Saudi dissident, WhatsApp, the Israeli spy companies have developed a backdoor into WhatsApp. So you can know about that. Once you know about that stuff, it doesn't matter who's invented it because you use the technique. So I've read about this on the internet. I don't put... and it's not in the podcast, partly because there are only 6 episodes, I don't put much value in it because I don't see, for example, I don't see him being murdered. I discount murder at the end. I believe that it was either suicide or an accident. To be honest, I favour suicide. My friend, Richard Ingram's the former editor of Private Eye, prefers it was an accident. He peed off the helicopter pad, the helipad. He was peeing off the back of his yacht. The yacht wobbled because that's what happens at sea, and he went forward and then held on. But my number one witness for this is somebody I know and I've got great regard for. Is Kenny Lennox, a wonderful mirror photographer, who's on our podcast in episode 1 Monsters, and he says, I was the first man to identify Robert Maxwell. He's got a couple of moles behind his left ear, and that was the identification, no question. And the body was pretty untouched, and he looked good, apart from a braise on his kind of shoulder, like a graze or something like this, which one of the pathologists speculated was after he falls or jumps or accident, he holds on to the handrail for as long as possible. And this can happen and you think you're going to do it and then you change your mind. Or it can happen in an accident, he's pissed and he's still trying to hold on, but he's too heavy and then he slips in. None of that makes the software... because I've got strong... My deduction is it's either accident, it's not murder. I'm not going there. Were the Israelis grateful to him? Yes. I believe it's because of the earlier story rather than the later story. Israel today, or in 1991, didn't need Robert Maxwell like it needed him in 1948. That makes more sense to me.
Yeah. Well, they were putting the Promise software out there themselves, but when they brought Robert Maxwell in, he just had it all over the world because he was such a brilliant salesman. And they even used it to get nuclear secrets in America, I think. So that's how, useful he was around that time to them.
So there's some of that, but it's disputed. So
yeah.
So there is also the story of him shopping Mordecai Vanunu. So I don't know. Your listeners, viewers will know all this stuff, but I'll explain it to them.
Please explain it, yes.
Yeah. So Mordecai Vanunu was an Israeli nuclear physicist who worked on Israel's bomb. He worried about where it was all ending up. And so he came to London and blew the whistle and told the Sunday Times, Israel has got a bomb. They built it in the desert, and it's real. And Israel was very angry with him for doing this, and they used a honey trap. A sexy Mossad woman got in touch with Vanunu, and she managed to convince him to come to Rome, where he was picked up by the rest of the honey trap team, and he was put onto a ship, and it sailed from Italy to Israel. And then Vanunu spent, some 2 decades and more in prison. The allegation made by 2 MPs was that Robert Maxwell had told the Israelis about Mordecai Vanunu. Now, Andrew Neil, who is a good journalist, then at the time the editor of the Sunday Times, was mortified that his source had been picked up by the Israelis in this way and went out of his way to investigate. And Andrew Neil's conclusion was that this was not Robert Maxwell's fault. Robert Maxwell was such an egomaniac that you can imagine him muddying the waters. But I believe Andrew Neil's account and the considered view of the Sunday Times that it wasn't Maxwell. Maxwell didn't know about the honey trap. He wasn't responsible for that. There are big questions about the judgment of the other guy who was involved, who was the Mirror foreign editor, a guy called Nick Davies, his office nickname was Sneaky, and he was a kind of Walter Mitty figure. I knew him a little bit, and Sneaky sums him up completely. Would he give tidbits to? So the way I think this world works is that somebody comes up to you and says, "We're very interested in what you're doing." And I work for an information company, and I don't say, "Hello, I'm Mossad." And you can't conclude that they're Mossad on the information they give you. And Nick Davis is the kind of person who would happily have helped somebody out like that without asking too many questions. The rule that we used to have on the Observer was a simple one when it comes to corrupt offers, which I like. Is you can have anything anyone gives to you so long as you consume it yourself in 24 hours. Which it's actually quite a lot of drink in my case. I mean, it's a lunch or a dinner, but that's it. Or it's not even a bottle of scotch, a half bottle. I can do that. A bottle of scotch on your own, that's a bit of a thing. A bottle of scotch with friends, that's okay. A case of wine is too much, I think. 2 bottles is just about all right. But anything else, and you say, well, no, I'm not doing that. Now, but again, there is no strong evidence that proves that Maxwell's connections with intelligence, I'm not disputing those, that those connections were major. And again, as I said, I think it's historic rather than, it was historic rather than active in 1991. I might be wrong.
Okay, I got 1 or 2 more questions on Robert then before we move over to Ghislaine. So in the assassination of Robert Maxwell, they describe a Mossad operation whereby he's up on deck and a dinghy comes in below the radar, goes up, and they get him in the neck with a needle. So my first question is, in the autopsy, are there any such marks on his neck that could indicate something like a needle could have been in there?
No. And West looks for them. He looks for puncture things, and they do. The first post-mortem, it happens on the Canaries. It's incompetent. It's incompetent because the people who do it have never done a big hot post-mortem before. The family are desperate for him to get buried quickly. You can call that suspicious. I think it's just they're in a hurry. There's a second post-mortem in Israel. It's a bit of a mess, but the guy who does it's very good. He concludes it's probably suicide, which helps the insurance companies because he's got a £20 million life policy, but it's voided if it's suicide. And so when Professor West says it's certainly the insurance companies who are paying for the post-mortem will be happy to read that. But he's not saying murder. But he's a Home Office pathologist. He is not the kind of man who would cover up on a murder. He isn't that kind of person. As I understand his reputation, I believe he's dead now. But there are no puncture wounds. Also, I mean, I can't see why kill this guy. He's He loves Israel at the end of his life. He doesn't want to do anything that's going to harm it. He doesn't, in my view, his big problem is his financial empire is finished and the wolves are at the gate.
Yeah, in that book, The Assassination of Maxwell, their premise is that because his empire is melting down and he's calling on his banking connections in the Mossad community, and because they're not delivering, and there's tension then arising between the two parties, and they've started to view him as a liability.
He was, well, I'm not thick with Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs has once been described as a vampire squid clamped on the face of humanity. A lovely line.
Who said that?
It was a writer for, I think, Mother Jones, whose name escaped me, but it's a wonderful line. A vampire squid clamped on the face of humanity. I don't think that they run their business according to what Mossad tells them to do. It's a New York firm, and it worries about Goldman Sachs, number one. Are there people in it who are Jewish who will help out Mossad on occasion? I'm sure there are. I'm also sure that there will be people in it who are British and American who will help out the British and Americans. The same go for the Germans when their own personal interest or something like common decency applies. I don't think that Mossad would be able to tell Goldman Sachs, it doesn't matter that he's stolen $60 million. By the way, again, $60 million, which I think was what Goldman Sachs were looking for at that particular moment, that is not worth killing somebody like Robert Maxwell. It really isn't. And the banks were owed $2 billion, but different banks all over the place. And their reputations as good banks were far, far more. So, and I think the way that the people that Mossad really worry about would be people like in Hezbollah, people who want to threaten, like the Syrians, like Saddam when he was alive, people who had the potential to destroy the state of Israel. They're the people that Israel takes out, not a Jewish businessman who's in trouble.
Okay, final question on his death then. So Ghislaine said that she believes he was assassinated. Have you researched what she has based that conclusion on?
Yes, she says that he was murdered. She uses the word murdered rather than assassinated. And it's that knowing what he was as a life force, she can't believe he could have committed. Kenny Lennox thinks the same way. And I've seen Kenny in various war zones and in various bars around the world, and I know, and I don't want to. If you love somebody, it's very hard to think of them killing somebody, and so I understand why Ghislaine. By the way, there's an argument about how to pronounce it. Ghislaine is the American pronunciation. We heard that it was Ghislaine, which I stick with.
And we've got a French correspondent who pronounces it differently from everybody else as well. So everyone's got their own version. Go with it.
So I don't want to be critical of Ghislaine on as regards this. And as I said, my friend Richard Ingram's, who was sued as editor of Private Eye many, many times. There was a British gangster called Ronnie, two gangsters called Ronnie and Reggie Cray, and there was a picture. They did a lookalike competition in Private Eye of Ronnie and I think Ronnie Cray and Robert Maxwell, and they transposed the two things, and Maxwell sued. It was a joke. But even Richard Ingram says that he prefers the story that Maxwell was having a picture off the side of the boat and then fell off, and I find that kind of sweet and generous of Richard to favour that, but there is no good evidence as to murder. To be honest with you, we don't know, and there is a problem sometimes with conspiracy theories, is that when you don't know, you can erect a great big theory about something which doesn't mean that it works. Yes, he was connected with Mossad. I'm not disputing that. But how big was the connection? How useful was he to them? What's the point of killing somebody like him? I don't see it, and there's no good evidence for it. So Occam's razor. Occam was some monk who used to live in Surrey, a bit like you. And
with this accent.
Anyway, this
Fish,
monk,
chips and peas, love, salt and vinegar.
So Occam, Occam's razor says, cut it down. The most logical thing is not murder; it's suicide or accident. As I said, Roy Greenslade, former Mirror editor, says that he killed himself when the balance of his mind was undisturbed because he realized he was going to get ruined and he couldn't come back this time. And I agree with Roy that I think it's.
And, we've got you here with a level-headed perspective versus some of the conspiracy theories going around. So this is good to balance everything out. All right, so you've meticulously described the rise and fall of Robert Maxwell. So now we're going to try and do a similar thing with Ghislaine. Who is she?
Well, she's, on the podcast, she's the fairy princess who ends up in a dungeon. And this is a dark, dark fairy story. She's very beautiful. She's very funny. She's charming. She has, to this day, friends and family who are standing by her, who are very loyal. It's very difficult to talk to people who know her well because they don't want to let her down. So all of that's in the bank. There are various Maxwell lost his oldest son, Michael, in a car crash, and it was awful. It rendered him in a coma. Basically, he was brain dead but alive. And he lived in a vegetative state for some years. And
How old was the son?
I think he was 18 or 19. And then another child died of leukemia, but he had 9 kids with Betty, so there were 7. And Ghislaine was born on Christmas Day, 1961. And I think the accident happened around the same time. And therefore, Ghislaine was the apple of her father's eye. And she was brought up in this wonderful gilded place, Eddington Hill Hall, it was built by the Morells, who was a beer family, a big brewing dynasty. And one of the people, they had a big fancy ball in this lovely place. It's built in, I think, the 1860s, and it looks like an Italian palazzo, the fashionable thing then. And one of the people who danced there was Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde once said, everything in life is about sex, apart from sex itself. That's about power. And some of the ways, or one way of explaining Ghislaine, is that she took that completely to heart. I don't know whether, I would imagine she would have known it. But she became, her dad loved her, spoiled her rotten. There is this dark story from Eleanor Berry, which we discussed earlier, that her father beat her in a way which feels very creepy. I don't know whether that story is true. What is true is that of all the children, he loved Ghislaine the most. But it's also true, and it's in Betty's book, that he would rage against Ghislaine too, and that he would get very, very angry with her too, and make lives miserable. And he would rage, and Betty says on several occasions, he would turn on Ghislaine, even though he loved her. Somebody from the Mirror phoned me up. It's not on the podcast, but he told me this story that Ghislaine had, at the Labour Party conference, she went out drinking with this guy and the other execs of the Mirror. They had a dinner, and then they're having a drink late at night, and I've got a business meeting at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I'm very worried about missing it. And my mate said, well, get the hotel to give you an alarm call. This is before mobile phones. And she says, I'm still worried. And he said, I've got an alarm clock. I always carry it with me. I'll go and get it. He goes up to his hotel room, brings it. So I'm still worried. I said, all right, I'll call you. I'll call you at 7:30. So she's got three methods, right? The phone call from the hotel, the mobile alarm clock, and my mate's going to ring her. All three happen. She says, thanks very much. Here's your alarm clock back. I'm having breakfast with my father. Now, I've got two kids, a son and a daughter, but and both of them take the piss out of me like there's no tomorrow. But the idea that my daughter in particular would treat me with anything other than withering contempt, or a bit love, obviously, but the idea that she would be so afraid of missing a breakfast meeting that you'd have that level of anxiety, I thought was so sad. So it's a very, very strange relationship. And the problem, and we talk about this in episode 6, Demons, is that if it felt at times that Robert Maxwell had a kind of cult of personality, and that's a phrase that Betty herself says, that we didn't stand up to Robert's cult of personality. Now, I'm not saying that Robert Maxwell was like the Church of Scientology. Are you a member of the Church of Scientology?
We did have some Jehovah's Witness apostates in here. I refrain from cults these days. I went and did the little personality test, though, just to check them out, the Scientologists in London. And they're still sending me letters to this day. Shaun.
Yes, no, I'm. If anybody watches it, you can see on YouTube. I'm not a fan of the Church of Scientology. By the way, this looks like a cult. There are two people here, and they laugh at all your jokes. And otherwise, you can feel their fear. And otherwise, they're and every now and then they give you food.
The biggest laugh of the night, though, was the unemployed geography dress. I'm dressed like an unemployed geography teacher. That was
well, no. So I was expecting this. I'd forgotten this was a studio. So I was. So anyway, I've given up ironing my shirts, and I'd never iron my shirts anyway. But Shaun, to be fair, he looks like a really good upmarket bouncer in a 1970s strip club in Widnes. Whereas I've come as an unemployed geography teacher.
Did you frequent such establishments? Is that how you know this, John?
No. It's how I met your mum, Shaun.
Oh, and
I wanted to say no.
My dad. Who was my dad? Who had you come on today? Oh, John, you can't. Oh,
no, that's. It's unfair-ish. Let's put it like that. No. Anyway, but I don't. But what you can do in this awful environment, if you've got a narcissist like Robert Maxwell, what you can do is that you don't have a proper childhood, and if you're the child, and this is true of the boys too as well, that you become everything is about serving the father. Once the father died, the worry is that Ghislaine went on to joined a second thing like a cult. Now, Epstein was different in that there weren't suckers on their knees giving him money for some kind of spiritual thing. But he had a very strange relationship with this guy, Les Wexner, who was the billionaire boss of Victoria's Secret. And at the very end, before Epstein died, Les Wexner put out a statement saying, this man has stolen a lot of money, millions from me and my family, and I wish I'd never met him. I regret ever meeting him. But the full story is unexplained. Nevertheless, Epstein had this, and I've talked to a therapist who deals with people who've left the Church of Scientology in LA and the podcast, and she talks about this. What you've got is you don't have a kind of flock because of the Wexner money, because Epstein got, I think in 91, But certainly when Wexner was roughly, he was in his early 50s, something like 53, Wexner gave Jeffrey Epstein power of attorney over his money, and his money was $2-3 billion. So, that's incredible. So that you know what power of attorney means. It means that I've got control over everything. Now, Shaun, it would be foolish if you were to give me power of attorney. But I actually don't do that. But I mean, my mum gave it to us before she passed away, but she was like 80 or something like that. That's when you do it, when you fear that you're losing your marbles and you want to give it on to your kids. You don't do this to somebody in their 50s. That's weird. And he wasn't, he's still alive.
Which makes you think there's more to it. And did you see the shareholder lawsuit this week?
No, I haven't seen that. No, what's that?
Yeah, the shareholder lawsuit this week is alleging that Wexner's basically done a PR stunt over this whole thing. And he and other directors of the Limited were knowledgeable of what was actually happening. And yeah, it really details.
I haven't seen that. I'll look into that. I don't know the evidence on that, and therefore I don't want to talk about it. I would be to talk about it at any length. I'd want to see strong evidence of that. The difficulty that I've got, common sense difficulty, is simple, and it holds true of virtually everybody who's in Ghislaine's Black Book, which was also Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book, is the vast majority of people didn't know what was happening in the dark behind the scenes, which is the girls. Now, Ghislaine herself denies this. She denies all the 6 charges against her. She denies any wrongdoing. I didn't do it. I didn't know what was going on. We won't know her exact defense until the trial starts, and it's slotted to start in July this year. Having said that, I think it's there's no strong evidence or rather, there's no evidence of any value that this happened in plain sight for others to see obviously. What happened is that there is evidence that it happened in particular in Palm Beach and also in the island. The problem is that those places were pretty private. So if you went to a party in Manhattan, you would see beautiful women, because Beautiful Women and Epstein went along, but they were 23-year-olds, not 14-year-olds. There's a huge difference. So that if the people in the Limited, Les Wexner, is accused of knowing about this other stuff, I am skeptical, because that goes against the run of the evidence that I've seen in the public domain.
So we interviewed Maria Farmer, I think it was the last one before she was legally gagged, and she said that she was by both Epstein and Maxwell at the Wexner property, and she spoke to Wexner's wife, and when she tried to leave there, as well as Wexner's personal security, she thought they were going to kill her, that when she called the cops basically said, well, half our department work at Wexner's gate. Good luck.
Yes, well, that's all. The problem is that in terms of the cultishness, Jeffrey Epstein seemed to have a hold over Wexner. For example, the power of attorney. And there are other people say, but he's very manipulative. So one of the people I spoke to was Hoffenberg. Have you had a chat with him?
We've got Hoffenberg coming on in a couple of days, actually.
Yes. So he's fascinating. And what he said was to me that there's evidence that that Epstein was money laundering for Robert Maxwell. You know this, and Steve Hoffenberg is very open about it, but Steve Hoffenberg himself went to prison for the biggest Ponzi scheme in America at the time.